I mean, the Wales commitment has been for a very long time. You're already past due. So I think that the problem is that it's not just really this 2% number that was agreed to in Wales. It really is just the functioning capabilities of the overall military. I think even if you look at other metrics, the Canadian military needs desperate investment right now to be able to have both its military equipment, its personnel, its training.
Canada is, quote, past due on NATO defense spending. That's the message from Mike Turner, chair of the U.S. House Intelligence Committee, on our program Question Period this weekend. He's part of a mounting pressure chorus pushing Canada to boost spending, including other U.S. politicians at the Halifax Security Conference over the weekend. Back in July, the Liberals did outline a path to meet the military alliance's spending promise, but not until 2032. Here's the Prime Minister defending the plan today.
In many countries, and perhaps even in most countries, more conservative parties have a better reputation in terms of investing in NATO, investing in the military, than more progressive parties. That's actually been the reverse in Canada over the past couple of decades. When my progressive Liberal government took office in 2015, the previous Conservative government had dropped investments in defense to below 1% of our GDP.
Defense spending isn't the only potential pressure point, though, with the incoming Donald Trump White House. Premiers, it appears, might be getting antsy about others, writing a letter to the Prime Minister today asking for clarity on how they will be included and engaged with, and which cabinet ministers will take the lead navigating the new administration. Let's bring back the front bench to talk about that. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, George Soul, and Laura Stone. Shakir, why don't I start with you in the letter from the premiers? Why now, do you think? And what might they be concerned about?
I think they're worried, they're scared for sure. I mean, you have a President Donald Trump that, will probably be a little more forceful and even, you want to say, reckless with some of his policies once he takes office. I think a lot of the premiers realize that the 2% defense target is intimately tied to a lot of the other economic things we want to do in this country. And I don't think I've ever seen in my life, not only the premiers, but, business groups, public opinion, so focused and so supportive of greater defense spending. There seems to be this unity that people understand that when President Trump says meet that 2%, he's not just saying it for the sake of it. There's going to be real consequences. And a conversation like that, especially in Canada, we've had presidents, I don't know, for the last, 15, 20 years that have been saying step up your defense spending. And we kind of just shrugged our shoulders like, we'll do it at some point. But I think now people really realize if you don't do it, whether it's our trade, whether it's our economic partnerships, that stuff is really going to suffer under President Trump. And I think right now, the premiers have seen Prime Minister Trudeau, talk about being committed to defense spending, but it's been a lot of rhetoric so far. And I don't think rhetoric is going to satisfy President Trump. So the premiers have a right to be worried about what happens next, because obviously they have a lot invested in the U.S. partnership and trade relationship.
Do you think, Laura, and certainly based on what we heard from the Prime Minister, but also Bill Blair, do you think that the quote-unquote Trump effect will have a tangible impact on the conversation around defense spending? Do you think ultimately a federal government, whomever occupies the position, will accelerate that timeline?
I actually think it will. I think the government now, the Trudeau government that's in power, is positioning themselves to speed up that timeline. You heard from the Prime Minister today kind of a full-throated defense of NATO and its importance and why Canada does want to spend more. And you could see, Mr. Trudeau kind of speaking there to a domestic audience, talking about the Conservative Party. That's obviously speaking to Canadians, not Americans in that context. But I would not be surprised if the Trudeau Liberals find a faster path to meeting that 2%. Keep expectations low and then surpass them. I think it is a real worry. As Shakir notes, I do think Canadians are taking it seriously, and that's why we saw the government release that timeline kind of preemptively, I think, after so many years of pressure. So I would not be surprised. And I do think that this puts more pressure on conservative leader Pierre Poilievre to outline his plan, because we haven't really heard about how he's going to meet those targets as well.
Dan, do you think that, for example, I think the real worry from my conversations is that Donald Trump's going to be like, our trade is completely linked to your defense spending, like to tie a very direct line between the two. Do you think, like, we've talked so many times about how it's not a huge domestic vote getter, right? Like, are Canadians overwhelmingly concerned with that when they go to the polls? Like, by and large, the evidence has shown us no. Do you think if that is the case, if our economic, prosperity is very directly linked by someone like President Trump, that any government, regardless of political stripe, will have a bit of cover in that area, like if they do want to meet those goals and spend that kind of money?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, Vassy. I think there's a growing consensus that Canada needs to do more to spend in this area. I think voters are largely agnostic to it. There are people in this country who probably think about this regularly, probably care about it, probably impacts their vote, but they're a very small minority in the far fringes of either of the parts of the political spectrum. And so I'm not sure most voters really are going to show up to a polling station in the next election with this on their mind. But I don't think it will discourage them in either direction if the government chooses to spend a great deal more, or if, to Laura's point, Pierre Poilievre puts some meat on the bones and outlines his plan to spend more on defense. I think the challenge will actually be in spending that money. I think we can make big commitments to spend 2% of our GDP. It's actually getting it out the door that the federal government struggles with. I mean, procuring in defense is a very long time horizon, and it's very difficult for the government to spend money on this. I do want to say on the letter to the premier, or letter from the premiers that were started the conversation here around, I think this has a lot less to do with the bigger macroeconomic conversation or the trade conversation, a lot more to do with provincial politics here in Ontario. I think Doug Ford issued this letter largely. He issued statements like this late last week. I think he's the chair of the premiers right now and is pushing this. I think he's spoiling for a fight with the Prime Minister. I think he's trying to engage directly on the federal stage in advance of an election he plans to call this spring, because it's to his political advantage to take on the Prime Minister and not his provincial opposition leaders. Kathleen Wynne did this pretty regularly with Stephen Harper at the time in order to sort of sideline her provincial opposition. I think Doug Ford's doing that in a lot of ways here. We're seeing him behave like the mayor of Toronto around this bike lanes issue, and he's trying to do it here with the tariff issue.
Are you telling me, George, that Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau are no longer BFFs? What? And Trump might be the incentive for breaking the bromance? I mean, I think to Dan's point, like, we saw not only this letter, and to be fair, I don't think Doug Ford is necessarily like trying, saying negative things about the Prime Minister in this capacity, but he is trying to be at the front of the file. I can tell, right? I think everybody can, and we'll get Laura to weigh in on it. But he's trying to say, like, get rid of Mexico, drop them from the trade talks, and he's the first one to come out and say that. Then he's the first one to send this send a letter from everyone. We want clarity on who's leading the file, that kind of thing.
I think for sure, and I'm never one to defend Doug Ford on pretty much anything, but I will say somebody needs to take leadership, right? And if you look at Wab Kinew, he's saying a lot of the same things. Is that, like, right now we just have the Liberal government saying, don't worry, we got this Trump thing under control. We've done it before, we can do it again. Meanwhile, they can't even figure out how they want to buy people's votes, as we were talking about in the last session. So I think that the premiers are trying to move forward with a real plan because they don't see any leadership coming out of this government. So I think you hit the nail on the head. Defense spending is going to be linked to how Trump looks at us for trade. It's going to be linked to how he looks at us for immigration. Frankly, Russia wants the northern part of our country. And if we're not at least stepping up in one way or another, Trump's not going to be there to defend us. And then other NATO countries are going to be less serious as well. So I think what the provincial leaders are doing is coming around and saying there's no leadership coming out of Ottawa. So some of us actually need to make sure the rubber hits the road, and we're actually in control instead of letting Trump drive all over the road.
Laura, I have just 30 seconds left. Is the bromance officially over? In our premiers ultimately, while trying to do what George says for sure, also trying to further their own political interests here?
I think Doug Ford and Wab Kinew are the new unlikely BFFs on the Canadian political scene. Doug Ford has praised him so many times. I think that, we saw Justin Trudeau in the last election run against Doug Ford in Ontario. Then the election was over and they were making announcements together again. I mean, this is political opportunism. This is what happens. I think what Premier Ford is doing is trying to, as we've all talked about, get out ahead and he'll find somebody to blame if things go badly, right? I mean, he wants to be the first out of the gate on these suggestions about Mexico, on who's in charge in the federal government. And I think it's obviously easier for him to do that sort of from the sidelines, although it obviously has a huge impact on Ontario. He wants to be at the forefront in case things go sour, and he can say, "I told you so." But I don't think we can ignore the political landscape that's happening here right now, with all of the talk of an early election, a potential early election in Ontario. And I think Premier Ford is relishing his role as the chair of the Federation on this file.
Elections everywhere. Thanks, guys. I appreciate the discussion. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Laura Stone, and George Soule, our wonderful front bench.